Hi, I want to ask some questions about advertising and then research, which we keep coming back to. So the Commission recommended that government ban gambling shirt advertising, front of shirt advertising in elite sports, and reduce the volume of gambling in sports stadiums generally. Were you surprised that government didn't follow this advice?
So I think I'll say a bit and Tim may want to join in. I think, so our advice was based on the evidence, and particularly in terms of exposure to more vulnerable people, particularly children associated with the Premier League. Government does have to balance a range of things. So our responsibility is around gambling and the licensing objectives. We are not required to make wider considerations in terms of the financing of football, for example. So government will have to factor those things in. Our advice is our advice. We felt that there should be changes made, and government made its assessment and has decided not to make those changes. Obviously, there is the voluntary agreement with the Premier League for front of shirt, but that was the decision that they took. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, as Andrew said, I think there's a range of wider considerations that the government rightly needs to take into account that as a gambling regulator we don't need to take into account when we give our advice. We focus purely on the licensing objectives in the Act. I do think it's important, though, when you look at the white paper, there's actually a really comprehensive package of measures in the advertising space. So whilst a lot of the coverage focused upon sports sponsorship, the consultation that we've got live at the moment around restrictions on cross-selling, I think will make a real difference. I think similarly, the future work that we will be doing linked to the white paper as well around kind of incentives and bonuses is another area in that kind of advertising space that could make a real difference as well. So I think seeing these things as a package is really important.
We talked about the fallibility of statistics, but we know that YouGov, their polling shows 60% of people think there's too much gambling advertising, around 77% within football alone. I mean, do you think gambling policy on advertising is being held to a higher standard than in other issues? So we know we've had Professor Heather Wardle speak to us, and she says that this causal connection, it's impossible to prove. And why are we even asking for this? Why is there such a high standard when it comes to gambling?
I think there are two issues there. One is public acceptability and whether people like it or not. So it's something that when I meet people I haven't seen for a while and we talk about where I work, they'll inevitably want to complain to me about the level of gambling advertising, although that's not actually in our remit. It is something that is in society not particularly popular. I think that is different to, as you make out, that causal link. So our advice was based on the available evidence. The white paper is a rare opportunity to explore this issue. And, we were clear, we felt there should be some reductions in this space. Is it held to a different standard to other things? I think that in the end is a political decision as to what people want to do with it, because you will sometimes struggle to have a truly definitive evidence base because these are complicated things. If you look at problem gambling overall, the circumstances can be extremely complicated and lots of different things can play a role, including advertising. We do know that people who have problems with their gambling are more likely to gamble when they see advertising. But drawing a causal link between the level of advertising and problem gambling is exceptionally difficult to do, as it is in lots of other areas.
And just on this subject of research, do you accept that the funding model of research on gambling is a bit messed up here? I mean, I know in your previous incarnation as the National Lottery Commission, you funded lots of good people's stuff out there. My previous office mate when I was an academic, Dr. Emma Casey, she's now at York. Her stuff on women doing the lottery, you funded that and people are grateful. But at the same time, you mentioned, Andrew and Tim, quite a few times this patterns of play research, which amongst the academic community seemed to be really problematic because the industry had their fingers all over it. So I think when it went out for tender, part of the promise was that the data set would be available for public good for all afterwards. It was online gambling companies for independent academics to analyse, but actually when the project finished, all that data was taken away, the people who worked with it were told they're not allowed to touch it again. I mean, it just looks a bit fishy that there is a huge paucity of genuinely independent scholars working in this area. They don't have access to the data. The industry controls it. What can you guys do to loosen things up there?
Well, I think the White Paper's decision to create the statutory levy is a big part of that solution. I think it's a very big part of that solution, and if the model is something along the lines of, for research, there is an independent research council that is used to commission and oversee that, I think that would be an excellent step forward. At the moment, you have different groups vying within the same area. It is difficult to get long-term funding. This is an area that we think is under-researched. Actually, I think probably research in this country is very good internationally in terms of the volume of it, but we don't think it is enough. So I think that is a big step forward with the statutory levy being used in this area. I think there will always be an argument about the data and access to it. I think some in the industry fear that data will be used by people who've made their minds up. So they're very cautious about the use of data, and others feel they can't get access to the data. The industry must be hiding something. And that's where I think having an independent research council and the right standards around it will help encourage more research, truly independent research, as you say, into the area of gambling. I think that can only really be a good thing. And at worst, it will tell us that some questions are difficult to answer or can't be answered. And that would be a step forward in itself.
I mean, Paul Blomfeld alluded to this as well, that now that the regulatory settlement fund's been closed, all that money's been hoovered up by Gamble Aware, and there are people who sort of, because of the industry influence, they feel that's not the appropriate vehicle, the right mechanism for this. Do you get the point being made there?
The money has not been hoovered up by Gamble Aware. We've set up a system stabilisation.
There are some organisations who may not want to engage with them because of their industry influence.
Well, I think it's as we said earlier, the Commission's not in a position to be a commissioning body for research. We weren't set up as one, we're a licensing body, and we don't have the resources or the funding to do that. A long-term solution is needed, which is what the statutory levy is about. People will make criticisms of Gamble Aware. I think some of those criticisms are unfair, but people will hold their view. The current funding model has relied very largely on industry funding, and there are people who will be unhappy with that. They will feel it's tainted, and they decide to not deal with different bodies. I think that is a view that people are entitled to hold. But I think the future lies in there being a more independent approach. So the model is based on a statutory levy where there should be no concern about the origins of the funding or any control, even if that assumption was misplaced.
And then just lastly, on consultation, I mean, these things are all interconnected. So the fact that there are so few independent academics in the area means that those who are stretched very thin. So there is an imbalance in these consultations that, your independent researcher working in a university with loads of students and other demands on them will be outgunned and outnumbered by the whole might of the industry. So, they have to be strategic and choose which consultations do they reply to. It's not something, when I was an academic, we had to account for every hour of our day. What were we doing? Funded research, independent research, teaching, marking, blah, blah, blah. So people like that are going to just fall through the cracks.
And the reassurance I would give is that when we consider consultation responses, we don't treat this like a kind of referendum or independence or a kind of a opinion poll. We don't weigh the responses on either side of the argument. We look at the quality of what's being provided. We look at the evidence base, the strength of that, the independence of it, and we supplement it with our own kind of research and data gathering as well. And I feel confident that actually when we've run consultations, that risk of perhaps one side of an argument outgunning the other doesn't really play into it. We may get a lot of responses on one side of the argument, but if they're not driven by clear, robust evidence, they are not going to carry as much weight.
If I could just add as well, I think our advisory groups that we've set up are really relevant in this space. So the gap, if you like, that you've articulated, I think is one we've recognised, and that's why we set up our advisory board on safer gambling, which brings together a whole load of experts, academics and others to help us understand what the evidence base is, out there, and actually to generate some interest in the academic community, which is, you know, also important. I think it's not a panacea for the issues you've described, but then we supplement that with advice from our other advisory panels. So we have one on lived experience, and we have a digital advisory panel as well, which is important in the context of the market we regulate. So I think that's also important, the things we're doing to kind of plug some of those gaps.
So going forward, what safeguards can you build into the statutory levy process that sort of all stakeholders are equal, or to even the playing field?
And I think that's probably more of a question for DCMS, because they're leading on the setup of the statutory levy, and they will consult on it. We, based on Section 123 of the Gambling Act 2005, he says, in a proper yes minister moment, we will have to be consulted on that as per the Act. So we will give our views on how we think this should be structured. I do think, though, the general premise of the way that the levy has been described has those safeguards, that you have, you know, that independent research and funding to, I think, allow academics to be a bit more dedicated in this space. I spent 3 years working in a research-intensive, STEM-intensive university. Although academics would violently object to me describing myself as anything remotely close to an academic, but I have had to see the balancing act, and it is very difficult. The load between teaching and everything else, you know, and you've got your ref submissions and all of that stuff. It does make it very difficult, particularly in an area where funding is harder to come by or is debated. So I think this is going to be a big step forward, but it will take time. It will take time to grow a community of people who are interested in this field and will come at it in the right way. And you know, what we've set out in the evidence gaps and priorities work is where we see some of those very clear gaps that exist that do need that research. So that people aren't just starting from scratch. We're trying to guide people towards where we know there isn't as much information as we think we should have to try and assist with this. But you do need to have that funding framework in place, as has been necessary for any field of academic study.
Okay, thanks. No, it'd be good to have a champion from academia on there. Thanks.